Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft that helped bring Imperial Japan to its knees. From the devastating firebombing campaigns that turned her cities into infernos, to the atomic missions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this plane became a symbol of unstoppable American air power. But a question remains: was this iconic aircraft ever used in Europe against Nazi Germany? The answer is yes, though not in the way most people imagine. In fact, a single B-29 operated out of England in 1944, not as a weapon, but as part of a brilliant psychological operation, a piece of deception designed to terrify German intelligence into believing that squadrons of superfortresses were about to descend on the Reich. During the late 1930s, as tensions in the Pacific grew, the United States foresaw a potential war with Japan. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, though formidable, lacked the range to reach targets deep in Asia. Boeing responded to a new Air Corps requirement, winning the competition to build a bomber that could fly farther, higher, and carry a heavier payload than anything before it. Development of the B-29 began in 1941. Production was immensely complex, involving over 19,000 subcontractors and advanced technology that had never before been integrated into a single aircraft. By the spring of 1944, the first B-29s were ready for combat, though they remained notoriously temperamental. Their Wright R3350 engines were prone to catastrophic overheating and fires, forcing crews to treat them with both skill and respect. Yet, when operational, the Superfortress was a marvel of engineering. It could cruise at 350 miles per hour and soar to altitudes nearing 32,000 feet, well beyond the reach of most Japanese interceptors and anti-aircraft guns. Unlike the B-17s and B-24s pounding Europe, the B-29 was fully pressurized, allowing crews to operate comfortably at extreme heights. It also featured 4 remote-controlled gun turrets, each armed with twin .50 caliber machine guns, and could deliver a devastating bomb load across unprecedented distances. Initially, the US Army Air Forces planned to deploy the B-29 in Europe. Bases in Britain and even Egypt were considered for operations against Nazi industry. But by late 1943, delays in production and a promise by President Roosevelt to aid nationalist China's fight against Japan shifted priorities eastward. The ambitious plan, codenamed Operation Matterhorn, called for creating bases in British-controlled India, while forward operating strips would be carved out of Chinese territory beyond the Himalayas. Supplying these remote bases meant flying all fuel, bombs, and spare parts over the Hump, the towering Himalayan range, infamous for brutal weather and deadly turbulence. Still, the Americans pressed on. The question was how to get the new bombers to Asia without alerting the Germans. There was real fear in early 1944 that Luftwaffe fighters based in France or northern Italy could intercept the B-29s as they ferried across Africa and the Middle East. To misdirect German intelligence, the US decided on an elaborate ruse, one that involved sending a lone B-29 to England, letting the enemy believe a massive new bomber force was gathering for strikes against the Reich. That aircraft was B-29 Hobo Queen, which departed Marietta, Georgia on March 1, 1944, for a top-secret mission. Hobo Queen wasn't a standard production aircraft. She was a YB-29. One of only 14 pre-production test models built with special modifications. She would be the only YB-29 to serve overseas during the war. Under the command of Colonel Frank Cook, Hobo Queen flew first to Gander, Newfoundland for refueling, then crossed the Atlantic to RAF St. Morgan in Cornwall, England, arriving on March 6th. 2 days later, she continued to RAF Bassingbourn, where she began a series of demonstration flights across southern England, visiting bases like RAF Nuthampstead, Horsham St Faith, today Norwich Airport, and Glatton. Everywhere she landed, Hobo Queen drew crowds. British and American servicemen alike gathered in awe to see the enormous silver bomber. Even Prime Minister Winston Churchill, General Dwight Eisenhower, and other Allied leaders came to inspect the technological marvel. Officially, her task was to test airfield load capacities for heavy bombers, but her real mission was psychological. US intelligence hoped that German reconnaissance would photograph the aircraft and conclude that dozens more B-29s were hidden in England, ready to join the B-17s and Lancasters, devastating German cities. And indeed, their plan worked perfectly. During Operation Steinbock, known as the Baby Blitz, a desperate German bombing campaign against British cities between January and May 1944, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights captured images of Hobo Queen parked on English runways. Nazi intelligence dutifully reported that the Americans had deployed a new super bomber to Britain. German newspapers, including the Völkischer Beobachter, even published speculative articles about the aircraft, further spreading the illusion. To make the deception more convincing, the Allies reportedly dropped propaganda leaflets over Germany, boasting of an impending new American bomber offensive. Meanwhile, the real B-29 groups quietly took off from the US and followed the southern ferry route via Africa and the Middle East to India, unmolested and unnoticed. After completing her mission, Hobo Queen departed England on April 4, 1944, flying via Marrakesh to Cairo, then onward to Karachi in what was then British India, and finally arriving at Kharagpur 2 days later, the staging area for flights over the Himalayas to China. From there, she joined preparations for the first B-29 strikes against Japan. Remarkably, Hobo Queen survived the war. She was eventually scrapped in the late 1940s back in the United States, her quiet role in Europe's psychological theatre largely forgotten. So why weren't B-29s actually used in combat over Germany? The answer is simple. By June 1944, the Allied bombing campaign in Europe was already achieving complete coverage. The B-17s and B-24s, operating from England and Italy, could reach every target in Germany. The B-29's enormous range was no longer needed there, but it was invaluable in the vast Pacific, where Japan's home islands demanded flights of thousands of miles. Still, the B-29 would eventually return to Europe, not for war, but for science. In 1946, the US launched Project Ruby, a secret test program to evaluate deep penetration bombs against reinforced concrete. During the war, both the British and Americans had struggled to destroy heavily fortified structures such as U-boat pens and V-weapon sites, whose concrete roofs were up to 23 feet thick. Engineers had developed massive ordnance like the 12,000-pound Tallboy and 22,000-pound Grand Slam earthquake bombs, but tests were needed to see how they performed against real targets. Europe, ravaged by war, provided the perfect proving ground. The US chose the abandoned German U-boat pen on the island of Heligoland, off Germany's North Sea coast, isolated, durable, and ideal for testing. 3 B-29s, fresh from the Pacific, flew to RAF Marham in Norfolk, arriving on March 15, 1946, accompanied by 4 B-17s loaded with support and technical crews. Additional B-17s joined from RAF Mildenhall. Beginning on March 25th, the bombers unleashed a series of tests, dropping experimental ordnance, including the American 22,000-pound Amazon bomb, the rocket-assisted 4,500-pound Disney bomb, and both British Tallboys and Grand Slams. Despite the onslaught, none of the weapons managed to penetrate the U-boat pen's concrete shell. The tests proved that even the most powerful World War II bombs could not defeat the thickest German fortifications, a lesson that would shape future generations of precision bunker busters. Yet the B-29 story in Europe didn't quite end there. In the post-war years, the Royal Air Force found itself with no modern jet bomber until the arrival of the English Electric Canberra in 1954. To bridge the gap, the United States loaned the RAF a fleet of surplus B-29s, redesignated as Washington B-1s. From 1950 to 1954, these massive aircraft flew from British bases once again, not as weapons of deception or war, but as symbols of Anglo-American cooperation in the dawning Cold War era. When the Canberra finally entered service, the Washingtons were returned to the US Air Force, closing the final chapter in the European history of the Superfortress. The B-29 remains one of the most technologically advanced and influential bombers ever built, a machine that changed the course of the Pacific War and briefly fooled the Luftwaffe into fearing an apocalypse that never came. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.